would now like to welcome Alan Wakefield again from the Imperial War Museum. Alan is head of First World War and earliest 20th century conflict at the Imperial War Museum, where he leads the curatorial team charged with interpreting and largely hugely varied collection of material that they have.
Great, thanks, Derek, and thank you for the invitation to return to give you another talk. So tonight I'm going to be looking at Britain's air war over the Western Front, 1914-18. Obviously, start by saying the obvious. In 1918, Britain established the world's first independent military air service, the Royal Air Force. November 1918, so around the time the war ended, the RAF totaled 22,647 aircraft. That's of all types, trainers right through to fighters, bombers, etc. In 188 squadrons. And in terms of personnel, there were just over 30,000 officers and about 263,000 other ranks. If we contrast that with August 1914, the RFC, as it was then, half of what became the Royal Air Force in 18, numbered 63 aircraft in 4 squadrons, and there were 105 officers. And I haven't got a figure for other ranks, but obviously it's a hell of a lot less than 263,000. So a huge increase by the end of the war. And by the time of the armistice in 1918, the RAF had established a number of well-defined operational roles, and it had become a key component in the Allied victory over Germany. So in this talk, I'm going to attempt to tell how the RAF achieved all of this through 10 aeroplanes. 10 aeroplanes, this is a subjective, is my 10 aeroplanes that I think defined the RFC stroke RAF air war over the Western Front and the future independent role of the RAF after 1918. So as we all know, air power was increasingly important during the First World War. And by 1918, it was basically pretty crucial in its direct support for the army. Throughout the war, it developed various roles such as photo reconnaissance, artillery spotting, flying contact patrols, and as the war went on, actually involved in a ground attack on enemy positions. And as well as being integral to victory on land in 1918, the RAF, as I said, developed a number of independent roles that only air power can take on. These were strategic bombing and fighter defence of the United Kingdom. And interestingly, being at the Imperial War Museum, of course, Duxford, one of our sites, is a product of the RAF's rapid late war expansion to fulfill the many demands made on it. Duxford was opened in 1918. Obviously, it's more famous as a Battle of Britain sort of fighter base. But in 1918, it opens as a training base for aircrew for two-seater squadrons, primarily day bomber squadrons. But these are the men who are actually undertaking those sort of independent operations and some of the army support roles, those crucial roles. And many of the the big surviving hangars, the Belfast hangars at Duxford and the associated technical buildings still on site, are a witness to those early days of the station. Although if you go there now, everything is really geared around 1914, the Battle of Britain. But there are these First World War echoes that you can see around the airbase. So we'll look back on the RFC RAF air war, and we'll look at our first aeroplane, which is the BE-2C. This was really the RFC's workhorse between 1914 and 1917. When the RFC is established in 1912, they want basically a good standard aeroplane. Initially, they're flying more or less anything that they can get their hands on. And in fact, when the RFC goes to France in August 1914, they fly there with numerous types of aircraft. And this isn't really efficient because numerous types of aircraft means that serviceability, spare parts, pilot knowledge, mechanics knowledge of actually repairing these aircraft, and also replacement general manufacture is not going to be sort of concentrated into one particular type of machine. So they need to standardize on a single general purpose aircraft in 1914. And for reasons of economy, the RFC in its early days is quite reliant on the Royal Aircraft Factory. And they look at the B-2 series of aeroplanes, and this becomes its standard reconnaissance aircraft. Now, it was chosen because it's a very stable aircraft. In fact, many people said it could almost fly itself. Now, weirdly, in this aeroplane, as it was a reconnaissance aeroplane, the pilot actually sits in the rear cockpit with the best view, and the observer is in the forward cockpit. So he's got quite a restricted view. So as a role for an observer, it's not actually ideal. And of course, as ideas of air fighting move forward away from taking up your own rifle, shotgun, or hand grenades to try to drop on other enemy airplanes, the B-2 was not a great fighting platform because it's a very stable aircraft. You can't throw it around the sky. It's not very fast, but it could be. You could fit a Lewis gun, and you would mount this Lewis gun so it was firing away at an angle so it didn't hit the propeller. So if you were going to shoot at an enemy airplane, you had to be quite good at maneuvering your aircraft in and sort of shooting off at an angle. So it's no point getting an airplane in front of you. So these sort of mounts were put together by individual pilots. So different people sighted guns in different places on the aircraft. So they were all basically a bit Heath Robinson. But despite these drawbacks, this is the key machine, the B-2C and the B-2E that comes afterwards, in which the RFC really expanded its core trade, which was the cooperation with ground forces. And if we look at a couple of these roles, aerial photography, for instance, trench deadlock in 1914 means that you cannot do your typical traditional reconnaissance behind enemy lines. It's impossible to send the cavalry out on a patrol because of the complete trench deadlock on the Western Front. So the aeroplane is ideal. The aeroplane gives you an elevated observation platform that can get beyond the enemy front line and tell you what's going on. And it's really and aerial photography is really a great example of war driving technology forward. When the war breaks out, the RFC are using a number of handheld Panros press cameras. But from 1915, they're very quickly developing purpose-built aerial cameras, such as this, the L type. Commanders on the ground were initially skeptical about what results could come out of aerial photography, but they are quickly won over. And this really happens at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, when Lieutenant Charles Darley of 3 Squadron is constantly out photographing the German lines around Neuve-Chapelle. And he finds and actually photographs new trenches that have been constructed. And by sending those photographs into headquarters, he gets the plan of attack changed for Neuve-Chapelle. So it's really the first bit of evidence for photography affecting a British major plan of attack. Darley was also fusing his photographs together to form mosaics, and this became standard practice as the war went on, as we can see here in this photograph. And of course, the aerial photographs were key for the Royal Engineer Survey companies in producing trench maps of various scales and updating those trench maps to show new German defences when they had been constructed. Very quickly, Hague is won over to aerial photography and the major benefits it can bring in intelligence gathering. And from 1916, aerial photography is a standard part of the BEF's intelligence gathering sort of network of information that's actually coming in to headquarters at various levels. Another great role for the BE2 sort of where the RFC learnt its trade was in spotting for artillery. So in 1914, most artillery action is direct fire. So the gunners are firing on targets they can physically see. But with trench warfare and the increasing range of guns, you start to have to bring in indirect fire, where you're firing basically off the map onto targets that you can't physically see yourself. So the problem is how to locate these and then hit them. Well, the aeroplane again is the tool to use, because you can firstly send out your aeroplane to take the photographs or to do the recce work to spot the positions you want to hit. And then when it comes to actually firing on that target, the aeroplane can spot the fall of shells and range the guns onto the target. Now, initially, this was done by firing flares, but obviously that's only good if the weather is good. But in 1915, they fit a 20-pound wireless into the B2C. That is basically air to ground. It's not ground to air. So up until really late in the war, there is no ground to air comms by wireless. If you wanted to communicate with an aeroplane from the ground, you would have to do visual signaling from the ground. So not great in terms of comms, but you can signal from the aeroplane to the ground, which was crucial for artillery spotting. And to help with this, they bring in what's called the clock code. The clock code is developed in 1915. What you would do is you would place a celluloid disc, such as this one here, you can see in front of you with these markings onto your map, with the target being in the center. Then lines radiate out as per a clock from 1 to 12. And then you have up to 8 concentric rings set at distances from the target. For instance, you can see A there. A is set at 50 yards from the target, going out 100 yards at a time. So after making wireless contact by Morse code with the artillery battery and getting an answer, the plane would fly over and say the first fall of shot was recorded at what would be A9. A9 would be morsed back to the artillery battery, which meant your shot has fallen 50 yards west of the target. Corrections would carry on until you were hitting the target, when the aircraft would signal OK to the battery, and then the signal either go on firing or gunfire. And then general corrections would be given if needed during that firing burst. And then once the target appeared destroyed, the aeroplane would signal end, and then the last signal for the end of an artillery shoot would be CI for coming in, so the aeroplane would be returning back, hopefully with the enemy artillery battery or whatever it was actually destroyed. So the signalling process becomes better and better as the war goes on. There are soon RFC signalers at artillery batteries rather than having artillery signalers doing that. So there's RFC guys at the artillery batteries. The clock code remains in place throughout the war. It's a good system. So if it isn't bust, don't fix it. Keep it going. And as the war goes on, artillery battery and squadron officers go and visit each other's units. Again, that's to do with familiarization and forming a close working relationship between the two halves of this actually functioning offensive piece of work. Now, of course, with your BE2 trundling over the enemy lines, trying to take photographs or spot for artillery, the Germans are going to try to stop this happening. So our second aeroplane that we're going to look at isn't a British aeroplane. It's the Fokker Eindecker. So the Fokker Eindecker was really the world's first true fighter, or in the First World War terms, scout aircraft. So the increasing amount of recce work and artillery spotting meant that there needed to be ways of preventing this from happening by shooting down the enemy reconnaissance aircraft. Now, the French come up with an idea. Lieutenant Roland Garros, the tennis grounds are named after him in Paris. He came up with the idea of fitting metal deflector plates on the propeller of his aeroplane because he'd worked out that only a few of the machine gun bullets fired through the propeller would actually hit the propeller. So he thought if he put metal deflector plates on, they would deflect the bullets out of the way and he could still shoot through the propeller. And in fact, on the 1st of April 1915, he shot down a German machine. And a number of French aircraft were fitted with deflector plates. But unfortunately for Garros, he was forced to land behind German lines on the 18th of April. And his aeroplane was given to Anthony Fokker, who was working with the Germans, to copy the deflector plates. Now, Fokker went one better because before the war, he'd been doing experiments with what became known as interrupter gears. So the idea was that you could coordinate the rate of machine gun fire with the revolutions of the propeller, and when the blade was in line with the when the machine gun was going to fire and the blade would be in line, it would prevent the machine gun from firing. So in other words, it just interrupts the fire of the machine gun to make sure it doesn't shoot the propeller off. And Fokker basically harnessed the interrupter gear to the Fokker Eindecker, giving the Germans a massive advantage over the Western Front. And they were deployed. The aircraft were deployed from the from the autumn of 1915. Led by Oswald Bolker and Max Immelmann. Eindecker pilots soon took a heavy toll of BE-2s. In fact, Immelmann got his first victory on the 1st of August 1915. The Eindecker was construction is tubular framed steel, giving it it was very strong, so it had excellent diving characteristics. And the tactics used by Eindecker pilots became known as the Immelmann turn. And the idea was that the Eindecker would fly high and then dive to attack from behind, where the BE-2 and many other aircraft at the time were undefended. They still didn't have the observer in the back with the Lewis guns. Now, if the target wasn't shot down at the first pass, the Eindecker could climb again and repeat the attack. And the Immelmann turn enabled either a second attack or evasion if the Eindecker itself was being attacked. What would happen is that the pilot would dive. He would then execute the first part of a loop. At the top of the loop, he would roll his machine out level. That would give him the opportunity either to make a run for it or to then come down, finish the loop, turn his airplane again, finish the loop, and come down behind the enemy machine and actually shoot it down. And the dominance that the Fokker Eindecker had at the time, it became known as the period of time became known as the Fokker Scourge, and over 100 Allied aircraft are listed as falling victim to the Fokker Eindecker. Now, a little bit like the Tiger tank in Normandy in the Second World War, where everybody seems to have thought they were up against Tiger tanks. It's the same really with the Eindecker. There were only ever 50 Eindeckers in service at any one time and only 300 produced. And there was another aeroplane very similar, which was called the Pfalz E1. So quite often when people said, "Oh, I've been shot at by a Fokker Eindecker," or an Eindecker took down, my chum in the squadron, it was actually a monoplane Pfalz that had shot them down, but they were all just named as Fokkers. So that's a little bit on that thing where it seems to have had a really big psychological effect that everybody thought the Fokker Eindecker was going to get you. Now another reason why So many British pilots were shot down at this time. Wasn't just that they were flying not particularly good aircraft, but also these men had very poor training. Many new pilots only had 20 hours solo flying, and any combat training they'd done was mainly done on the job. So it was either basically you learnt on the job and you survived and you got better, or you were shot down, and basically that was the end of your flying career, if not your actual life. And of course, we were still overly reliant on the BE2. Um, but we had to keep going because Trenchard, who was head of the RFC, he was very offensive minded, and his idea was that the RFC had to support the ground forces. So you had to do your recce flights, you had to do your artillery spotting, and it had to be done no matter what the losses were going to be. But by early 1916, things were so bad that any reconnaissance machine going over the lines was accompanied by 3 fighter planes. And if any of those fighter planes was forced to return to base, the reconnaissance machine and the other machines would have to turn round. So this was putting a huge strain on the RFC's ability to actually do its core work. So they needed aeroplanes to combat the Fokker Eindecker. We haven't got interrupter gears at this time, so ingeniously we decide to come up with aircraft which were nicknamed pushers because the engine is at the back of the plane. So it's behind the pilot, behind the observer, which does mean you can fire a forward machine gun without having to hit the propeller. So these aeroplanes are developed from 1915, and the two that are really key are the FE2B and the DH2. The FE2B is a 2-seater armed with a couple of Lewis guns. Although it wasn't great in single combat against the Eindecker, what they did was they actually, once attacked, they would fly in groups of 2 or 3, and once attacked, they would basically fly in a circle and use their machine guns for mutual defense against the Eindeckers. So it's almost like forming a wagon circle, if in those westerns that you see, and they would just fly round and round and shoot at the German targets as they were attacking. The DH2 was different. The DH2 single-seater, very nimble aircraft, and it overcame initial poor reputation. Initially, it was called the spinning incinerator. Not great if you had to go off and fly one of these, obviously. Not going to instill much confidence into you. But it was a good aircraft. And in fact, thanks to the RFC's first air race, Lannoy Hawker, it became very, very popular and successful. And it equipped the RFC's first true fighter squadron, which is number 24, under Hawker. And that went out to France in February 1916. Along with these British machines, the RFC was loaned a number of very good Newport 11s. These are very fast, highly maneuverable aircraft. And again, they don't have a synchronized forward-firing machine gun. What they have is a Lewis gun mounted on the top wing, which can fire forward but over the propeller. So again, it's forward-firing, fast, nimble machine, better than the Eindecker. And it was in this aircraft that Albert Ball scored some of his first victories. So those 3 aircraft really end the Fokker scourge. The end of that is really marked by the death of Max Immelmann on the 18th of June 1916, following combat with some FE2Bs. And luckily for the BEF, that defeat of the Fokker Eindecker, so the sort of superiority starts to move back towards the Allied forces now, comes just at the time when Haig needs to ramp up the RFC's work for the Somme offensive. So it's just at the right time. So we're going to move on to the third of our aircraft now. And this aeroplane is really only included for the fact that it was a bit of game-changing technology rather than it being a fantastic aeroplane in its own right. So the aeroplane is the Sopwith 1.5 strutter. And the reason for including this aeroplane is this is the first British aeroplane fitted with an interrupter gear. So the first RFC machine with a forward-firing Vickers machine gun. Began arriving with squadrons in late May 1916. It was a multi-role aircraft. It was already being used by the Royal Naval Air Service, and it was now in frontline service with the RFC. This machine also begins the RFC's working relationship with the Sopwith Company. As I said earlier, the early days of the RFC, they're over-reliant on the Royal Aircraft Factory, but they start to come in and they get involved with private companies. The RNAS had already been ordering Sopwith aircraft before this, and the RFC order does clash with the RNAS order at one point, but they start to have the machines produced under license by other companies to keep up the actual ramp up the production rates of Sopwith aircraft. And of course, this relationship between the RFC stroke RAF and Sopwith is very, very fruitful as the war goes on. We have the Sopwith Pup, Sopwith Camel, the most famous one, the Sopwith Dolphin, and ultimately the Sopwith Snipe. So the 1.5 strutter, so it's a good rather than a great aeroplane. It had long range. It was well armed if compared to the BE2. As you can see, it's got rear firing Lewis gun, forward firing Vickers gun. It was a great shame that this machine was not available in larger numbers earlier on, and we could have started phasing out the BE2C and the BE2E, and many more pilots' lives would have probably been saved. But even so, this is not a great dogfighting machine, and the distance between the pilot and observer made communication in the air, especially during combat, very difficult. And it was really outclassed by early 1917, but it still had a role as a long-distance reconnaissance machine as long as it was escorted. It couldn't really be left to itself, and it was finally replaced in RAF service in about October 1917. So we'll move on to our fourth machine, another two-seater. And in fact, this was the machine that ultimately replaced the BE2. And this was the RE8. The RE8, really given the name, well, given the initials RE8 for Reconnaissance Experimental 8, because it wanted to be distanced from the BE type of the BE aircraft. So this is another Royal Aircraft Factory machine. Being named RE8, it quickly became nicknamed the Harry Tate after the music hall comedian of the time. And this was going to be the RFC and RAF's workhorse for the rest of the war. It's got a forward-firing synchronized Vickers gun and rear-mounted Lewis guns. It's still underpowered, really, but it's a lot better than a BE2. It entered service in October 1916. Initially gained a bad reputation for spinning amongst inexperienced pilots, but they modified the tail fin to make it easier to fly. The only problem with that was it made it more stable to fly, which meant that it wasn't as maneuverable. So again, if it gets attacked in combat, your chances of really getting out of combat flying an RE8 aren't brilliant unless you're a pretty good pilot or your observer's very, very good with his Lewis gun. But despite drawbacks, the machine stays in service right until the end of the war. Over 4,000 of the RE8s are produced. And this is the machine that does that core work right to the end of the war. So photo recce, artillery spotting, and tactical bombing as well with the RE8. They also refine contact patrols. Now, contact patrols have been started in 1915. Now, the contact patrol was a way of identifying the most advanced positions held by your attacking infantry, because obviously you're reliant on field telephones where the cables get cut, or runners who don't always get through with their messages. So the idea would be to fly an aeroplane patrol at set times over the lines to find out where your forward troops were. Now, the procedure for this was the aeroplane would fly across the battlefield and sound a klaxon horn. When the klaxon horn was sounded, the infantry would respond either with coloured ground flares that would be let off in shell holes or trenches, or they would flash tin discs into the sun, and that would tell the aeroplane where your front line was. Your observer would mark things down on a map. You would then fly to a designated HQ post, drop a message streamer with the information, then he could fly back and potentially do another contact patrol, and the information would be with the headquarters really quickly. So it was a good way of trying to get information quickly back to commanders. The great problem was that quite often the infantry weren't too happy about giving away where their position was, because obviously the Germans can see a ground flare if it's been let off. Potentially you can see a disc being flashed in the sunlight. So sometimes the infantry didn't actually respond, which meant that the aeroplanes had to fly lower and lower and lower. So they could even get an idea of spotting the colour of the uniforms worn by the soldiers in the front line. So you can imagine how close to the ground some of these aircraft were flying, which meant they were under massive threat from ground fire, as well as being very low and then having to get back up to altitude with German fighters coming in and trying to shoot them down. The other thing that the RE8 did, which was unique, was at the Battle of Hamel in July 1918. RE8s of 9 Squadron made the first parachute airdrop of ammunition supplies to advancing Australian forces. So an ammo resupply, an air ammo resupply, was tried from RE8s. So it did sterling service until the end of the war. Unfortunately, a little bit like the B-2, it came up against a very, very good German aircraft, and that's going to be the next aeroplane we're going to look at, and that is the Albatros D3. It's an excellent machine, and it followed on from the D1 and D2. It's a fast, robust fighter with a good rate of climb. It was considered pleasant and easy to fly. It had a slight weakness in its lower wings, so pilots were advised not to perform steep or prolonged dives. But apart from that, it was a really, really good machine. And just over 1,800 were built, and it was still in frontline service well into 1918, and then developed into the Albatros D5. And of course, this helps the Germans wrest back air superiority over the Western Front in 1917, and we have what was called Bloody April, where the RFC lose 151 aeroplanes, 316 aircrew, and the average life expectancy of a new RFC pilot in Bloody April was 17 days. It's really the worst point of the air war for the RFC, and unfortunately, many of the machines facing the D3 are RE8s, and the Germans really get on top here. They establish Jagdstaffeln, which became shortened as Yastas. These are specialist fighter units. They're established in August 1916. And the most famous, of course, is Jasta 2, which is formed under Oswald Bolker. And after he's killed in a mid-air collision in October 1916, his place is taken by Manfred von Richthofen. And by April 1917, there are 4 Jastas based at Douai. That's across from Arras, on the Arras front. And they combine into that famous flying circus that Richthofen has. And what they do is they fly standing patrols of 6 to 8 German fighters all day. These planes are up. 6 to 8 fighters are always up as a standing patrol. And in the morning and evening, there are large air sweeps across the front. Now, they're not going far beyond the German front line, if at all, because they know the machines they want to shoot down are the reconnaissance machines and the spotter machines, which have to come over the German side. They have to come over the German front. So the Germans can sit their own side of the line and basically mop up the RE8s as they come across. And in fact, this in Manfred von Richthofen's own words, he said, "Let the customer come to the shop. There's no point going over the British side. We can shoot them down just as easily on our own side. It also means if we get in trouble, we land on the right side of the lines and we're ready to go again." Now, to combat these Albatross fighters, the RFC have only 2 squadrons of Sopwith Pups, and they are the only aircraft that can hold its own against the Albatross D3. Sopwith Pups have a single machine gun firing forward. It's slightly slower, but much more maneuverable than the Albatross. And to help the RFC, a number of RNAS Sopwith triplane squadrons come onto the Western Front on attachment to the RFC, and they're flying escort. Again, it's that thing about having to fly escorts to your reconnaissance machines. So it's really a case of deja vu again for the RFC, especially those men who had actually survived the Fokker scourge. They were in that position again now into 1917. And it's because the Germans get that air superiority that our next aircraft come in. We have to develop our own key fighters. So the 6th aircraft, well, I'm actually cheating here. It's actually 2 aircraft because I can't make a decision between them. They're both bloody good aircraft. Was of course the SE-5A and the Sopwith Camel. So really, this is sort of akin to Spitfire and Hurricane in the Battle of Britain. You've got 2 great machines, both in service at the same time. We'll look at the SE-5 first. The SE-5A was probably one of the best designed British aircraft of the First World War, one of the fastest aircraft of the First World War. It was highly stable, but also very maneuverable, and it was an excellent gun platform as well. Relatively easy to fly, so it was a good sort of machine, a good mount for not massively experienced pilots, but if you learn how to fly this thing, you were likely to stay alive flying it. Excellent performance at altitude, and it was able to match the Fokker D7 that came in, a great German fighter that came in 1918. It's armed with 1 synchronized Vickers machine gun and Lewis gun on the top wing. It's also able to carry 4 25-pound bombs, and it was flown by aces such as Albert Ball, James McCudden, and Mick Mannock, all seen here. Now, it has quite an inauspicious start to its career, this aeroplane, because it initially goes to 56 Squadron when Albert Ball is with 56 Squadron at the time, and it's found to be underpowered. And Ball and his comrades are not very happy with this new, because it's supposed to be the game-changing machine. But he's got these teething problems because of the engine. And Albert Ball and others suggest modifications to the aeroplane. Those are adopted. It becomes the SE-5A, the improved version. And Ball goes on to secure 11 of his 44 victories flying an SE-5A. It entered service on the Western Front first in June 1917, and by the end of the war, 21 RAF squadrons and 2 American squadrons are flying SE-5As. So it's a great fighter. Alongside this, of course, we have the famous Sopwith Camel, an excellent dogfighting machine. It has 2 synchronized Vickers machine guns firing forward, and the metal fairing, which helps to house the gun breeches, which helps to stop them from freezing at high altitude, creates a small hump in front of the cockpit, and that's why it's called the Camel. That's the hump of the Camel. So that's how it got its name. This is unlike the SE-5A. This is a really maneuverable machine in the hands of a skilled pilot, but it's potentially lethal if you're a novice pilot. The big problem with this machine is it's got a rotary engine, which means the whole engine spins round, and 90% of the weight of this aircraft, so the engine, the pilot, the guns, and the fuel tank, are all packed into the first 7 foot of the fuselage. So if you can imagine that, and the rotary engine producing huge right-hand torque, means that if you move the aircraft to the right, you could very quickly go out of control and end up in a spin. And if you weren't an experienced pilot, that is basically what would happen to you. And quite more often than not, once you were in a spin, you weren't getting out of it. There was a joke in the RFC about the camel. It said that the camel offered the pilot the choice between a wooden cross, the Red Cross, or the Victoria Cross. So one of the three. One of the three if you were lucky. So to assist new pilots come to terms with this aeroplane, they did actually have some two-seater versions. So you could actually learn before you ended up potentially going into combat with your with Camel. And again, this was flown by a number of aces. It entered service initially with the Royal Naval Air Service and then with the RFC, including it as a home defence night fighter as well. It was also used in that role. Over 5,000 were produced, and it's credited with downing 1,294 German aircraft, which is more than any other type in the First World War. And they really complement each other, the SE-5A and the Camel. And alongside the French, a really good French fighter, the Spad 13, these three machines win back sort of air superiority for the Allies in the second half of 1917. And from that position, it's never really lost. Even though the Germans bring in the Albatros D5 and the Fokker D7, the Allies stay on top really for the rest of the war. And in 1918, both the Camel and the SE-5A are even flying ground attack operations. From the start of the war, there is an attempt to bomb ground targets from the air. Up until the Battle of the Somme and even through the Battle of the Somme, mostly these are targets of opportunity. So things that are spotted, quite often even the bomb racks are cobbled together by the squadrons themselves. They're not standard issue. And they went out, bombed any targets of opportunity they could. But as the war goes on, there's more and more need, and it can be seen that these sort of attacks, these tactical attacks, are actually useful for the army. And in the German spring offensive in 1918, of course, every single part of the army and the RFC has to be used to stem that German advance on the Western Front. And every available aircraft is being used to try to hold back that German advance. And there is low-level strafing attacks on troop concentrations and transports. And casualty rates in squadrons are up to 30% a day in these things. You were basically going out with basically a 1 in 3 chance of probably coming back. So not brilliant odds, but everybody knew they had to be out there holding the Germans back. And then once the Allies go on to the attack in the 100 days from the Battle of Amiens in August 1918 onwards, ground attack is an integral part of the British tactical planning. Air power is integrated into what becomes the all-arms battle. So that means you have artillery, infantry, tanks, aircraft. Everything is coordinated together to keep that offensive going, to keep pushing the Germans back. And number 8 Squadron under Trafford Leigh-Mallory, got the Duxford Link, more famous in the Second World War. He is in charge of number 8 Squadron, and their assigned task is to support the tank corps. And what they are doing is they are experts in spotting and then taking on and destroying German anti-tank guns. So they'd be flying at low level, strafing, bombing anti-tank guns ahead of the tanks which are coming forward with the infantry advance. So that's where these fighters actually ended up. They ended up as a ground attack machine as well. Now, the next aeroplane takes us away from the core army cooperation role of the RFC RAF into the strategic field. And again, it's not a British aircraft, it's another German one. This time it's the Gotha heavy bomber. Now we've got to remember that Britain was bombed early in the war, so from 1915 onwards, by German airships. But airships were very much a problematic weapon. They were very much at the mercy of weather and atmospheric conditions. They had very poor navigational aids, and often missed their target by a huge margin, including missing the whole city of London and bombing places way to the north. In fact, if you look at London raids, 26 raids were planned by airships on London. Only 9 of them actually reached central London. And of course, by the time of the development of the explosive or incendiary bullet, the days of the hydrogen-filled Zeppelin or Schütze Lanz, which was the other airship, but again, they all called them all Zeppelins, was really numbered as a strategic bombing machine. And then the Germans switched over to aircraft. Aircraft were really a game changer. They were less at mercy of weather conditions. They were able to fly in mutually defending formations during daylight, which meant they had easier navigation to their targets from their bases in Belgium. The formation of aircraft could carry a greater bomb load than a single airship which would be launched. And the British had developed a home defence network, which was all based around shooting down a night-flying, high-altitude Zeppelin airship. This totally threw the whole system out of sync, bringing in aircraft. So we had to develop a new system. So by 1918, they had set up the London Air Defence Area to deal with raids by German bombers. So as you can see on this map here, the capital was ringed by anti-aircraft gun firing areas, between which were night fighter patrol zones. That's to keep our airplanes away from our anti-aircraft guns. So you're trying to minimize the threat of friendly fire there. The observer corps and light ships are used to report sightings or sound of approaching aircraft. That's all fed into the comm system that comes back to the defences to get ready. Just east of London, there's a barrage balloon apron. So really, apart from the lack of radar in this system, this is very similar to the defensive network for London that was set up in 1940. And of course, by 1918, we've got very good aircraft here as home defence fighters. We've got Sopwith Camels and we've got Bristol fighters. Well, I'll come on to the Bristol fighter later. And they do have some marked success, and they shoot down about 24 German bombers at the time. But of course, the bombing of British cities, there's a call for reprisals, and we have to strike back at Germany. And striking back at Germany means that the RFC needs to get into its own strategic bombing. Now, strategic bombing had already been carried out by the Royal Naval Air Service. It was ahead in this regards, and it had started in 1916 with Sopwith 1.5 Strutters. And then in October 1917, they formed 41 wing RFC. 2 RFC and 1 RAF squadron were put together. Based near Nancy in France, they were hitting German industrial and rail targets in Germany. So they are actually flying. This is the first strategic bomber offensive into Germany, where we're actually going now. And on the 17th of October 1917, 11 RFC aircraft attack Saarbrücken. And this offensive builds up, and then in June 1918, what became the force became known as the Independent Air Force. It's a large bomber force of 4 day bomber and 5 night bomber squadrons. The largest aircraft at this time are the Handley Page 0400s. The 0100, the initial large Handley Page bomber, had been used by the RNAS. This larger airplane was now in service. It had a wingspan of 100 feet and a fuselage length of 62 foot. So it's almost the same size as a Lancaster. You can imagine a biplane bomber the same size as a Lancaster. Incredible bit of kit. It had a range of 700 miles and an endurance of about 8 hours flying time. Between June and November 1918, the independent force made 650 raids against military and industrial targets, mainly in Germany, bombing such places as Mannheim, Saarbrücken, and Cologne. Of course, those names would be more famous 25 years later in the huge bomber offensive on Germany, spearheaded under Arthur Harris. And in fact, in November 1918, the RAF were planning to bomb Berlin. By this time, we had the Handley Page V-1500, and we were going to stage this plane out. It was going to fly out via Prague. By that time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had broken up. So they were going to basically fly out to Berlin, drop some bombs on Berlin, stage to Prague, and then back to Norfolk. Unfortunately, the weather was too bad to fly in early November, and by the time they were going to try it again, the armistice had come along, so it was never attempted. However, one of these large Handley Page bombers, which was called Old Carthusian, was flown out to India, and on the 25th of May 1919, it bombed Kabul in Afghanistan and helped bring an end to the Third Afghan War. After the war, many of these Handley Page bombers helped kickstart British civil aviation. Sir Frederick Handley Page, very forward-looking aviation pioneer, had established Handley Page Transport, and he started air, mail and passenger flights between London and Paris, with the London aerodrome being Handley Page's factory in Cricklewood in North London at the time. So there we have the step into civil aviation. But our next aeroplane, our next showcase aeroplane, is another bomber. It's the DH-4, Britain's first purpose-built day bomber, probably the best single-engined bomber aircraft of the First World War. That's at least in my opinion. It was fast, easy to fly, and able to take significant punishment in combat. It had an altitude ceiling of 20,000 feet and a bomb load of 460 pounds. Its performance was not affected when carrying a full bomb load. It made it very, very popular with its aircrew. Its speed and altitude performance enabled it to avoid interception by all but the best German fighters, and it was very maneuverable, and it could sort of hold its own with against German fighter aircraft as well. So it's a good air if you had to fly into enemy territory a long way. This was a good machine to actually be in. It entered service with 55 Squadron in March 1917, and it was also very suitable, apart from bombing, it was very suitable for immediate army needs, such as long distance, high altitude photo recce work. In fact, Frederick Laws, who was the father of British aerial photography, felt that the DH-4 was the best aerial reconnaissance platform of the First World War. And of course, once strategic bombing started in these reprisal raids to hit Germany, DH-4 squadrons led the way. They started bombing, doing day bombing raids on Germany, and were able to fly in mutually defending formations and didn't really need fighter escorts. The only drawback with this aeroplane, as you can see from the photograph, is that the pilot and observer are quite a long way away from each other, the fuel tanks in between them. So again, communication between these two, because you haven't got a wireless headset, is very difficult in combat. So they came up with a replacement aeroplane, the DH-9, where they moved the fuel tank to in front of the pilot's cockpit, so the pilot and observer are very close together. The problem is the DH-9 had a lower performance than the DH-4, mainly because they bought in an aeroplane, they bought in an aero engine that wasn't up to the job. A new engine was being produced, and they already put the government had put a huge order in, which they found it very difficult to cancel, and they ended up with a lot of engines which weren't up to the job, which meant that unfortunately the DH-9 suffered very heavy casualties from German fighters. It was much better in other theatres of war where it didn't come up against the latest German machines, but the DH9 was a bit of a failure. They did re-engine the DH9 with either the US Liberty 12 engine or the Rolls-Royce Eagle 8, which are both fantastic engines. That aeroplane went on to become the DH9A, which was a great aeroplane for flying raids over Germany, and it continued in RAF service into the 1930s and was heavily used in Imperial policing operations in the Middle East and northwest frontier of India. So a machine, DH4, very good. DH9, a blip. DH9A, again, a great machine. But the DH4 was basically the birthplace of that. So our next aeroplane we're going to move on to isn't a frontline combat aircraft. It's the Avro 504K training machine. It's a pre-war, the Avro 504 is a pre-war design, a pre-1914 design. And it was one of the first aeroplanes to cross over to France with the RFC. And in fact, three of these machines did bomb the German Zeppelin works in Friedrichshafen in November 1914. But it was soon out of date in terms of frontline service. But it then went on to be a key training aircraft for the RFC. Now, the reason for this, obviously, I mentioned earlier that initial flying training was very ad hoc, and that the Fokker scourge, the survival rates for replacement pilots were very, very short because of their low number of hours solo flying and massive lack of actually like combat flying training. So they needed a way to improve the training because they found that they had a lack of instructors, a lack of good instructors at home, mainly because many of the pre-war civilian instructors actually joined up to go to fly with combat units. And some of the instructors at home were pilots who were either home on leave or a break from, or men being given a break from frontline service, or men who were suffering from combat stress. And I'm sure if you were suffering from combat stress, trying to teach a rookie pilot to fly one of these very rudimentary planes probably did very little for your nervous condition. So quite often students will rush through to solo flying simply basically to get them out of the way. And obviously that led to many fatalities. They were also using very much out-of-date aircraft to train people in. So when you got to a squadron, even some of the machines you were flying, they might not have been great, like the RE8, but they were way above what you'd actually trained on. So again, it was learning on the job, and you got better because you survived in combat. So they needed something better than this. So a man called Squadron Leader Robert Smith Barry comes along. Now, Smith Barry was a pre-war pilot and flying instructor. One of the original RFC pilots who went to France in August 14. And in 1916, he was commanding 60 Squadron on the Western Front, and he was shocked by the poor quality of the pilots he was getting to his squadron. And he confronted Trenchard on a number of occasions, arguing that sending out such untrained pilots into combat was akin to murder. And he disparaged the whole training system of the RFC. So you can obviously think Trenchard must have been on the verge of basically giving this guy the boot. But Smith Barry instead gets his chance. In December 1916, he goes to Gosport in command of number 1 Reserve Squadron. This was a training school to produce flying instructors for the RFC, and all were taught a set standard syllabus. In August 1917, this unit is recalled or renamed the School of Special Flying, and the ethos is to get trainee pilots to fly a standard aircraft, one of relatively high performance, suitable for all possible maneuvers, and not a stable fly itself type like a BE-2, because that would give a novice pilot a false sense of security. The pupil needed to master both the machine and himself. That's what Smith Barry was saying. The aircraft needed to be dual control, so the trainee always sat in the front seat for the pilot and was given control of the aircraft for the maximum amount of time. So even if he got in trouble, the instructor would leave it to see if he could get himself out of trouble before making sure they didn't actually kill themselves. So you had to be bloody good to be an instructor in this in this unit. So even after going solo, a trainee would still fly 50% of his time in a dual control machine to learn more advanced maneuvers and learn how to recover and avoid spins and to fly sort of combat maneuvers, etc. So that when you went to your squadron, you actually had some idea of what the hell you were going to do once you got up there and came up against Manfred von Richthofen in the flying circus. The Avro 504J and K were perfect aircraft for this Smith-Barry training method. By the end of the war, 8,300 of these machines were built. And in fact, the Avro 504N only went out of RAF service in 1933 as a trainer. So it shows it was a good training aircraft right into the 30s. It was even used as a home defence night fighter in 1917-18 before the Bristol fighters were available in large enough numbers. So when they married this aircraft with the Smith-Barry system, it ensured that RAF flying training was standardised through 1918, and it gave everybody a much improved set of flying skills and knowledge of what to expect in combat. So it was a really good method, and the Avro 504 J&K was the key machine. So we move on to our final aeroplane. The Bristol Fighter, I mentioned it earlier on as a night fighter, home defence night fighter. This is perhaps the best multi-purpose aircraft of the First World War. It's one of the two-seater aircraft to replace the BE-2. First went to France with 48 Squadron in March 1917. It was first used in early April when a six aircraft patrol led by William Leaf Robinson. Now, Leaf Robinson was the man to first shoot down a Zeppelin. He had the VC for that, but he was given a squadron command in France. He was given these Bristol fighters, and it proved an absolute disaster. Of the 6 aircraft, 4 were lost, including that flown by William Leaf Robinson, who was taken prisoner. And the reason was they were flying them like two-seater aircraft. So they were just stooging around like they were RE8s, and it meant that the Albatross fighters were running rings around them. So they were trying to do mutual defence, and it was absolutely hopeless. They weren't using the aircraft's speed, fast climbing ability, and manoeuvrability to any advantage. Once this was appreciated, remember this has got a forward-firing Vickers gun and it's got rear-firing Lewis guns. Once this is appreciated, this aeroplane was absolutely brilliant. You could fly this and like a single seat fighter. It could hold its own against many German fighters at the time. So it could be used as a fighting machine, a photo wrecking machine, a tactical bomber, a ground attack aircraft, and a home defence night fighter. So it's almost any role the RAF would want, this machine could actually do it. And it proves it plays a key role in the 1918 success on the battlefield, that all-arms battle that culminates in the Allied victory on the Western Front. And in fact, the versatility of the Bristol fighter makes it a perfect machine to, when the RAF gets pared back at the end of the First World War, we wanted to cut defence spending massively, so they have to shrink the RAF. The RAF is fighting a battle at this time for it to remain independent. Both the Army and the Navy want their aircraft back. They want integral air components. They don't want an independent RAF because they're worried that an independent RAF will go off and do its own things and not do its tactical air support for the Army or support for the fleet. That's what they're worried about. And Trenchard, who had advocated all through the war that the RFC, RAF must support the Army at all times, he's now obviously got a key position within the RAF, and he wants to keep an independent air force going. So he plays on the growing public and political fears of strategic bombing. It's happened during the First World War, and says the RAF has to have a bomber force as a deterrent to stop other countries bombing Britain. He then says that also that, but there will be a threat from bombers, so we also need a home defence fighter force. And if we look, Duxford, in fact, Duxford survives post-war cuts. There are over 300 air bases in the First World War in the UK. By 1919, there are only 30, and Duxford is one of them. And Duxford becomes a fighter station in 1923. It switches from its training role to being a fighter squadron. So they've got these new sort of strategic and operational roles unique to an air force. So this really means the air force has to survive because the government's bought into this idea about strategic bombing and fighter defence. So it has to be independent. The other thing is, of course, the government is strapped for cash, and Trenchard says, well, actually, policing the empire, the RAF can do this very cheaply as well, because if there's an uprising in Iraq or in the northwest territory of India, it's much cheaper to send a handful of airplanes to go and bomb a village or strafe a tribal group who are revolting against the empire than it is to send a massive column of infantry, cavalry, and artillery winding away into the desert or into the mountains to actually bring these people to heel. So again, it's key, and key amongst those planes to do that policing role. I've mentioned the DH-9A already, the Bristol fighter. And the Bristol fighter remains in that role until 1932. It's a brilliant machine. It's reliable Rolls-Royce Falcon engine. It's got a robust design. It's suitable for the rough and ready conditions on the edge of empire. And this machine really carries on into the 30s. So as the 20s and 30s roll on, the RAF has new priorities away from those army cooperation roles, and that's really withering away now, army cooperation. There is an army cooperation command for a number of years, but it's really only happening in the empire. It's not happening in the idea of a war in Europe at all. The army puts its faith in mechanisation, but the trouble is the lack of money makes this unachievable to the extent it really needs it. And it really means that when the BEF goes to France in 1939, it has very little effective direct air support. And although the BEF is fully motorised, it's largely an infantry force and it lacks adequate armour force and mobile artillery really to back it up. And the Germans have really learnt that the Luftwaffe is really basically an army cooperation air force, and the Germans have got that lesson from the First World War. The British, to keep that independent force, have gone away from it, so that all arms battle capacity that the British had in 1918 is lost by 1939, 1940, and it doesn't really return until the creation of the Second Tactical Air Force to support Allied ground operations in Europe in 1944. Thanks very much.